Welcome to Trading Nation. I'm Courtney Reagan. We're joined by Jack Caffrey, Equity Portfolio Manager, J.P. Morgan Private Bank. Jack, thanks for joining us here today. You know, we've had a decent run here for the S&P 500 and the NASDAQ, I think looking to close higher for the sixth time in about 7 sessions. But we also have a lot to come this week, not the least of which are these trade talks that are going to go on in Washington, which has, of course, caused some uncertainty in the past. What do you think will happen to the S&P 500 specifically as the markets begin to digest all of what's to come this week?
Sure. I think, if I can step back from just the week, I mean, the intermediate longer term setup remains very positive. What we hear on any given day has always been, I wouldn't say noise, but there's noise as well as the news. And I think ultimately it falls to us to try to extract what is really news, what's really noise. And I do think what we come back to, thinking about earnings, thinking about the economy, that news has been very positive and very supportive. What we're going to hear from necessarily out of politicians, tweets, incremental data points, those have always been a little bit more challenging. Just going back to last Friday, a lot of focus on what we could hear about healthcare, and ultimately kind of was sound and fear and didn't really mean all that much. And healthcare could rally as news wound up being better than feared.
So what is your outlook for the S&P 500, say, year end?
Over the course of the next 6+ months, we think we can make a 10% sort of total return in the equity market. We think that's going to be really earnings driven rather than valuation driven, especially as markets are starting to deal with the issues with respect to some changing government policies, particularly out of the central banks, particularly out of the Federal Reserve.
Speaking of the Federal Reserve, of course, they have a dual mandate. One thing they watch very closely is the level of inflation. And for a while, there was a fear that it was heating up potentially a little too fast after we had a very long period of time with very little inflation to speak of. But could inflation actually be beneficial for, say, some groups of stocks or any particular sectors?
Sure. I think if you go through and let's, with respect to the inflation commentary, I think what we've heard most recently is the idea that inflation risks are symmetrical, and the idea of overshoots might actually allow the Federal Reserve to be a little bit more accommodative than people feared as recently as a month and a half ago. Now, with respect to inflation and its beneficiaries in the market, I'm going to point to two. Certainly the financials might be beneficiaries if this leads to a higher interest rate environment or concerns of higher interest rates. And also it can be helpful for the energy stocks to the extent that higher inflation is caused by higher oil, higher gasoline prices. And I think that leads to questions what it might mean for the consumer.
And speaking of the consumer, we have a lot of retailers that are still going to report their quarterly results. I know we can't speak specific name-by-name companies, but what does inflation mean to this group after particularly an extended period of deflation in things like electronics or even apparel?
Well, I actually think most retailers would actually benefit from a discussion about inflation. For the most part, if you think about it, what works in retail is the idea of excitement. And one thing that could be exciting after, as you say, years of disinflation or absolute deflation might be the idea of somewhat higher prices. That might actually catalyze the consumer to actually spend sooner rather than waiting with the anticipation that it will be cheaper 3 months from now or 6 months from now. So I actually think inflation might help some of the retailers actually start prompting somewhat better comparisons.
And speaking of all those trade talks that we talked about at the beginning of the segment here, if those go into effect, retailers are afraid that price pressure will exist there too, which also might be hard to separate from pure inflation. But thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate it today, Jack. And thank you all for watching Trading Nation. I'm Courtney Reagan. We'll see you next time.